In early 1943, in German-occupied Warsaw, the operational situation was defined by two realities that rarely met on paper. The German security apparatus controlled streets, rail lines, printing presses, and the city's food supply. The Polish underground state, working through the Home Army and civilian networks, prepared for a future moment when those controls might weaken. That preparation required maps, not public maps, and not school atlases. Working maps for sabotage, for couriers, for storehouses, for assembly points, and for attacks that planners hoped would be brief and coordinated. Warsaw already had maps in drawers and offices. Pre-war municipal plans existed, along with cadastral surveys and utility diagrams. But occupation changed the city's geometry in practical ways. New guard posts appeared. Barricades and barbed wire redirected traffic. Buildings were seized, walled off, or repurposed. Rail sidings became military zones. Courthouses, schools, and factories gained new layers of restriction that could not be read from a pre-1939 street plan. Inside this environment, one of the people assigned to draw the city as it had become was a trained architect and planner, Stanisław Jankowski, known in underground work by the pseudonym Agaton. He was not the only cartographic hand in the conspiracy, and his work was supported by clerks, printers, messengers, survey-minded engineers, and scouts who walked the city with memory and caution. But he represented the type of specialist the underground depended on. Someone able to translate fragmentary observation into lines that others could act upon. Someone able to work in small rooms, and with poor light, using whatever paper could be obtained without raising suspicion. His routine did not look like the popular image of clandestine warfare. It began with ordinary movement through a city of checks and queues. He needed a cover identity, a plausible reason to be on the street, and a story that matched the papers in his pocket. He needed to arrive at an apartment, an office back room, or a workshop without being followed. He needed to carry materials that did not appear incriminating, yet would allow technical work to continue. The cartographic work was shaped by material limits. Good paper was scarce. Ink and carbon sheets were watched commodities. Typewriters could be traced through impressions and repairs. A single duplicated sheet, if discovered, could expose not only the drafter, but the distributor and the end user. So the underground relied on discretion and improvised production. They used tracing paper when it could be found. They used thin stock that could be folded into a pocket. They used methods of duplication that were quiet, small, and imperfect, accepting that readability mattered more than elegance. A typical task might begin with a base plan, often pre-war. On top of it would be layered new information gathered by observation and reports. A guard post on a corner. A patrol route at a predictable hour. A gate that was locked at night but opened for deliveries before dawn. A warehouse door that had been bricked up. A basement passage used by a caretaker. A stairwell that led to the roof. A courtyard that connected to another courtyard through a narrow passage. In dense Warsaw blocks, these inner connections mattered as much as streets. Yet information arrived unevenly. Some came from underground scouts tasked with looking ordinary. Some came from municipal workers who still had reasons to enter buildings. Some came from railway employees and tram workers with a view of transport nodes. Some came from building caretakers who knew cellars, coal bins, and service corridors. Some came from forced laborers who spent days inside German-controlled compounds and noticed what changed. The problem was not only to collect details, it was to decide what could be trusted. Rumor traveled fast in occupied cities. Fear distorted descriptions. A single exaggeration could put an armed group into a dead end. So the cartographic process required verification in quiet ways. 2 independent reports mattered more than one. A sketch from one messenger might be compared with another, and a street corner could be checked at different times, because German routines changed with alerts and shifts. The underground also had a doctrinal challenge. Plans for a rising, or for wide sabotage, assumed a certain tempo. They assumed coordination between districts. They assumed the ability to move messages quickly. They assumed that combat groups would know where they were going and why. Maps, in theory, would make that possible. But in practice, every additional copy was a risk. Distribution networks were fragile. A raid in one building could wipe out a whole chain. A courier might be stopped and searched on the street. A safe apartment might suddenly be unsafe because a neighbor had been arrested. The larger the operation imagined by planners, the more paper it required, and the more paper made the conspiracy visible. By mid-1943, as the cartographic work intensified, German terror in Warsaw escalated through public executions and mass arrests. Street roundups, known as łapanki, could clear a block in minutes. For the underground, this had 2 effects. It increased the urgency of planning, and it increased the chance that any routine movement needed for planning could end in detention. Agathon's work, and the work of those around him, depended on repeated, careful travel across the city. To reach a printer, to consult a source, to deliver an updated sheet. Each trip was a calculation. Not only the shortest route, but the least observed route. Not only the safest street, but the safest time. An underground cartographer had to think like both a designer and a fugitive. A map is meant to be read quickly, but a map in occupied Warsaw also had to be carried quickly, and hidden quickly, destroyed quickly if needed. Large formats were impractical. Fine detail could be lost in poor duplication. Street names could be risky if the map fell into the wrong hands. Sometimes a coded notation was safer than explicit labels. Within the Home Army's planning structures, map-making was tied to larger assessments. Which German installations mattered most? Which bridges and rail lines were strategic? Where weapons might be captured? Where prisoners might be freed? Where a building's thick walls could serve as cover? And where open squares would be fatal. Agathon's architectural training was useful here. An architect looks for structure and access, walls, angles, elevations, lines of sight. The thickness of a courtyard wall, the way a stairwell channels movement, and the difference between a wooden roof and a concrete one under fire. These were not abstract considerations. They determined whether a small group could cross a street, approach a gate, or hold a corner. Yet early signs of limitation appeared in the simplest questions. How current was current? A guard post could move in a day. A building could be emptied and refilled with troops with little warning. The Germans also learned. After each sabotage action, security would adjust. Access would be restricted. A gate once usable for entry would be welded shut. A street once lightly patrolled would gain a checkpoint. For the cartographic worker, this created a quiet kind of failure. A map could be correct and still become wrong before it reached the person who needed it. The underground could not update everything at the speed of occupation, and they could only choose priorities and accept gaps. There was another limitation, less technical and more institutional. The Home Army's planning for a national rising was bound to political and military assumptions about timing and external support. These assumptions shaped what maps were drawn. If planners expected a certain kind of fight, they asked for certain kinds of sheets. If planners expected Allied drops in specific areas, they needed landing zones and approach routes. If planners expected Soviet pressure to keep German units moving, they assumed German defenses might be thinner. In rooms where maps were compiled, those assumptions were present even when unspoken. A map is never only a picture of streets. It is also a picture of what its makers believe will happen. Through the end of 1943, German control in Warsaw remained strong. The underground suffered arrests and losses across multiple networks. Each loss was also a loss of knowledge. A captured courier might know a printer's address. A captured clerk might know where paper was stored. A captured scout might know which building's caretaker was sympathetic. So cartographic work often had to restart in miniature after a disruption. Reconstruction was slow. It required new meeting places, new cover stories, new channels. It required, sometimes, that a cartographer redraw from memory because the previous base sheet had been destroyed during an emergency. Destruction was not exceptional. It was standard security practice. If there was a risk of a search, paper was burned. If there was a risk of arrest, incriminating drafts were torn into small pieces and scattered. But the act of drawing therefore carried a constant tension. The better the map, the more time it took. The more time it took, the greater the chance that sirens, boots in the stairwell, or a knock at the door would interrupt the work. So choices had to be made. Simplify a building plan to the essential. Mark only the entrances that mattered. Use symbols rather than words. Keep the sheet small enough to fold inside clothing. By early 1944, the war's larger movement began pressing closer to Warsaw. The Eastern Front's direction suggested that the Germans would eventually be forced into defensive measures in Poland. For the underground, this raised the question of when a rising might be ordered, and how a city of nearly 1 million people could be made legible to dispersed groups that had trained in secret. Cartographic production accelerated. So did demand for specificity. Broad city plans were helpful for orientation. But combat in a city depends on corners, courtyards, staircases, and walls. It depends on knowing which streets are wide enough for vehicles, which alleys dead end, which buildings have cellars connecting to other cellars. It depends on the location of strong points and the expected direction of fire. A pattern emerged. The underground would receive a report of German presence in a building. The report would be tentative. Someone saw uniforms in windows. Someone saw a truck unload crates at night. Someone saw a radio aerial on the roof. Agaton's side of the process was to take that uncertain report and decide how to represent it. A question mark was not enough. Operators needed a location, an entrance, and an estimate of what kind of obstacle they faced. And this requirement pushed scouts into more dangerous observation. To confirm a strong point, someone might need to stand longer at a corner. To confirm a new wire barrier, someone might need to approach close enough to see how it was anchored. To confirm a machine gun position, someone might need to look up repeatedly, which attracted attention. Each confirmation risked detention. Each detention risked torture and exposure of others. Repeated strain showed in the way maps were treated. They were no longer only planning aids. They became fragile assets that had to be rationed. One copy might be shared among several groups, passed hand to hand. A commander might copy a detail by hand onto a smaller slip and destroy the original. Errors could multiply, not from incompetence, but from necessity. In the underground's internal logic, and the map was supposed to reconcile different parts of the city into one coordinated action. In reality, the city's districts were separated by German control and by the underground's own compartmentalization. A group in one area might not know the precise situation 2 kilometers away. Maps could bridge that gap only if they could be distributed securely and in time. As spring 1944 moved into summer, German countermeasures continued. Warsaw saw intensified security sweeps and patrols. German police and security services relied on informers and on the sheer weight of random searches. The underground could not guarantee that a safe apartment would remain safe for a week or even a day. Cartographic work in this period required constant relocation. A work table might be moved, and a small supply of paper might be split among several apartments so that one raid would not eliminate everything. Drafts might be stored temporarily in a wall cavity, under a floorboard, or inside innocuous household items. Every concealment method was a compromise between accessibility and safety. At the same time, new categories of maps were requested. Not only street plans, but facility plans, plans of prisons, administrative buildings, depots, and barracks-like installations, plans of bridges and approaches. Sometimes these were prepared in anticipation of capture operations, with the hope of obtaining arms. Sometimes they were prepared to support sabotage, with emphasis on access points and escape routes. In these facility plans, precision mattered. A wrong assumption about a wall thickness could change whether a charge would work, and a missing note about a secondary gate could lead a group into a controlled funnel. So cartographers sought building information from those who had legitimate reasons to enter. A janitor, a delivery worker, a maintenance technician, a clerk who had seen internal corridors. Each person who supplied such information carried a risk, even if they never held a weapon. As June and July 1944 arrived, pressure on the underground increased from its own expectations as much as from the Germans. The sense of approaching decision created demands for readiness. Readiness meant supplies, communications, and local plans that could be executed quickly. Maps were central to those plans, and therefore central to arguments about feasibility. Here, friction between lived reality and official doctrine became more visible. On paper, an arising could be coordinated across the city. On the street, curfews and random sweeps could sever district connections without warning. On paper, weapons could be captured and redistributed. On the street, a single failed attempt could expose a network and lead to mass arrests. On paper, messengers could cross the city. On the street, a stopped courier could lose everything in a pocket. Agathon and his colleagues could not resolve these contradictions. They could only draw the city as clearly as possible and hope clarity would compensate for scarcity and friction. Some maps produced in July 1944 were designed for operations that assumed time for coordination. A sequence of objectives. A route to a target. Fallback positions, roads for retreat. These were staff products, built for a planned fight rather than an improvised one. But Warsaw's situation did not allow staff ideals to dominate for long. Alerts and rumors arrived daily. Reports of front movement. Reports of German reinforcements passing through. Reports of Soviet proximity, sometimes accurate and sometimes not. The underground's leadership faced a narrowing set of options as the city's mood and the front's movement interacted. When the order came to begin open action, the demands on cartographic work shifted instantly. There was no longer time to perfect drawings. There was only time to provide something usable, something that could orient a group under fire, something that could support messaging between points. In the days and hours around the outbreak of fighting, the value of a map was not in its beauty, but in its survivability. Could it be carried without being lost? Could it be read quickly? Could it be understood by someone who had never seen it before? Could it be replaced if destroyed? For an underground cartographer, this period created a turning point in method. Complexity had to be reduced, not because detail did not matter, but because the conditions of use changed. A sheet that required careful study was less useful than a sheet that could be glanced at while moving. There was also a turning point in personal risk. Before open fighting, the main risk was arrest with incriminating paper. During fighting, the risk became physical destruction of the workshops and death of the people who had been sources and distributors. The map room was no longer a hidden professional space. It became another target in a city under bombardment and assault. In early August 1944, Warsaw entered the sustained combat of the uprising. While different districts experienced different intensities, and communications between them were inconsistent. Some initial objectives succeeded, others failed, and some were never attempted because weapons did not arrive where expected, or because German resistance was stronger than anticipated. In this environment, maps that had been drawn for planned sequences began to go unused. A plan that assumed control of a particular intersection was irrelevant if that intersection remained under German fire. A route that assumed a certain courtyard passage was moot if that passage had been collapsed by shelling. A building plan prepared for a raid was useless if the unit assigned to it was pinned down elsewhere or had suffered losses. This was not a matter of dramatic reversal. And it was the normal friction of city combat combined with the underground's chronic shortage of arms and communications. Many of the maps were correct, or close to correct. They simply belonged to a version of the fight that did not happen. The cartographic effort did not end with the outbreak of fighting. It adapted. New needs appeared, and they were immediate. Barricade positions had to be communicated. Connections through buildings had to be described. Improvised routes, including movement through basements and sewers in some areas, became operational realities that few had planned on paper in detail. Updating maps under these conditions was hazardous and often impossible in a formal sense. Information moved by messenger. A hand-drawn sketch might be made in one building and carried to another. Someone might draw a simple line showing a passable courtyard route and mark it with time-specific warnings. A wall that was intact in the morning might be broken by evening. Agaton, operating as part of a wider staff and technical network, faced the practical question of what to save and what to abandon. A cache of prepared maps might represent months of work. But if the building housing them was threatened, the maps could also represent evidence. If captured, they could show German forces where the underground intended to strike, what it considered valuable, and which routes it knew. The underground security culture persisted even under open fighting. When positions were at risk of being overrun, papers were burned. When evacuation was ordered from a building, documents were destroyed or carried if possible. In some places, this happened repeatedly, leaving no stable archive of what had been prepared. Quiet institutional pushback emerged in the form of competing priorities. Fighters and local leaders demanded immediate, localized sketches. Staff planners, when they could function, wanted coherent district-level orientation. Printers and duplicators, if they survived and had materials, asked for workable masters that could be reproduced. But shells and fires did not respect these needs. A duplicating device could be destroyed in minutes. An apartment used as a technical room could become rubble without warning. Even when a map survived physically, it might fail as a tool because the human network around it was collapsing. A map requires distribution. A map requires a reader trained to interpret its symbols. A map requires a shared understanding of objectives. And under siege, those requirements weakened. The uprising's combat environment also exposed another gap between doctrine and reality. Pre-uprising planning assumed a degree of synchronization between areas. It assumed that a drawn plan could translate into simultaneous action. But in practice, districts fought in partial isolation. Some areas held out for long periods, others were cut off, and some were crushed quickly. A citywide operational map became, in many hands, a set of disconnected fragments. Agathon's personal risk was not in grand gestures. It was in movement, in carrying paper through streets under fire, in entering buildings that might be targeted, in working in rooms lit poorly, with the sound of fighting outside, trying to make lines that could still mean something. There is little need to embellish the danger. Dead Warsaw in August and September 1944 was a city where buildings burned for days. It was a city where civilians sheltered in cellars with little water. It was a city where messages were carried by runners and where a short crossing could be fatal. In that setting, a person tasked with producing or moving technical documents faced hazards that were constant rather than spectacular. As the weeks passed, the consequences of earlier cartographic decisions became clearer. Maps prepared for the initial phase were now outdated. Maps that assumed access to certain streets were no longer usable because those streets were under direct fire. Maps that had marked German positions from late July were obsolete as German forces shifted, reinforced, and created new strong points. In some cases, the underground adapted by annotating maps manually. And a margin note: impassable. A pencil line: route through yard. A small cross: machine gun. These annotations were local and temporary, and they depended on the person holding the sheet. A map became less like a printed product and more like a living document that could disappear with its carrier. At the same time, the very existence of these maps became a burden. If a position was about to fall, a commander had to think not only about weapons and wounded, but about papers. Orders to destroy documents were part of standard practice, and during the uprising, they were executed repeatedly. A map that might have helped someone tomorrow could not be allowed to help the Germans today. This was the quiet peak of the cartographic dilemma. The better the preparation had been, the more material there was to lose. And the more material there was to lose, the more time and attention had to be spent destroying it instead of fighting or evacuating. Pushback from institutional procedure also existed in a subtler form. Cartographic work depends on standards, symbols, scale, consistent naming. But in the uprising, consistency was often sacrificed to speed. A sketch made by one unit might use local nicknames for streets or buildings. Another might use pre-war names. A third might use German administrative labels. Confusion was not a sign of carelessness. It was a sign of multiple systems colliding under pressure. German forces, for their part, used their own maps and intelligence, and they reshaped the city through systematic destruction. Entire blocks were leveled. Landmarks disappeared. Streets became fields of debris that did not match any pre-war plan, and a cartographer could not keep up with a city being physically altered at that scale. By late September 1944, the uprising situation had deteriorated beyond what maps could repair. Supply was inadequate. Communication between remaining pockets was extremely difficult. Civilians were exhausted. Positions were reduced one by one, and evacuation routes narrowed. When the fighting ended and capitulation terms took effect, the immediate cartographic question was survival of people and the prevention of reprisals. Individuals associated with the underground sought to avoid identification. For those who had worked on technical staff tasks, the danger was not theoretical. Documents could identify networks. Drawings could show intent. The safest map, in the end, was the one that no longer existed. Large quantities of underground documentation were destroyed in the final stages. Some was burned deliberately. Some was lost in rubble. Some was abandoned during evacuations. Some may have been buried or concealed and never recovered. The result was that a significant portion of the cartographic work produced under occupation did not serve its intended operational purpose. This is where the phrase "maps that were never used" finds its most literal meaning, not because the effort was irrelevant, but because the war's course and the uprising's outcome made many planned operations impossible. The maps were drawn for coordinated actions that could not be executed as designed. They were drawn for routes that became impassable. They were drawn for objectives that remained in German hands. They were drawn for a city that was then systematically destroyed. In the aftermath, the institutional response to this kind of work was complicated by politics. The post-war environment in Poland did not treat the Home Army and the underground state as uncomplicated heroes in official narratives. Accounts were controlled, discouraged, or reshaped depending on the period and the authorities involved. Technical contributors, including planners and those who produced documentation, were not always publicly recognized for the work they had done. Agaton survived the war. Like many specialists who had lived inside the underground, he carried skills that could be applied to rebuilding. Warsaw, reduced on a scale that defied ordinary description, required reconstruction that was both physical and administrative. And architects and planners became essential again, now working in the open, dealing with new institutions and constraints. The irony remained. Before and during the uprising, underground cartographers worked to draw Warsaw in a form that could be acted upon. After the uprising, the city had to be drawn again because so much of it no longer existed as it had. The pre-war plans were references, but not guides. The occupation-era drawings, when they survived, were records of a vanished urban reality. The quiet legacy of underground cartography is not a single dramatic document preserved in a museum case. It is a system of labor performed under occupation, collecting, verifying, drafting, duplicating, and distributing information in a city where paper could be as dangerous as a weapon. And it is the recognition that resistance was not only made of sabotage and firefights, but also of technical work done in cramped rooms with shaking hands and controlled voices. In Warsaw, the underground state attempted to function as a state, with records, planning, and coordination. Cartographic work was part of that attempt. It was a way to see the city truthfully when public truth was controlled by the occupier. It was a way to reduce uncertainty for people who would have to move through danger. And it was a way to make a future operation imaginable, even when the present was defined by limits. Many of the maps never fulfilled their intended role. Some were rendered obsolete by time. Some were prevented from reaching the hands they were made for. Some were destroyed because security required it, or some were tied to plans that could not survive contact with reality. But the act of drawing them was itself a form of organization, and organization was one of the underground's central weapons. Today, the underground cartographer is easy to overlook because the work leaves fewer visible traces than other forms of wartime labor. A demolished building is visible in photographs. A battle is visible in reports and casualty lists. A clandestine map, folded, burned, or lost, often disappears without a trace. What remains are scattered references, surviving sheets in archives, and the knowledge that a city's resistance once depended on people who could translate streets into lines and lines into decisions. If this story helped clarify a less seen kind of wartime work, consider subscribing for more World War II forgotten stories and overlooked roles.